Good afternoon. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Bojana Stoyanova, who is an evolutionary ecologist interested in mating systems and population genetics. She finished her PhD in 2013 in Montpellier, and from there moved within France for postdoc in Nantes, and then spent 7 years in Czech Republic working on the topics of mating systems, population genetics, and the effects of climate change on adaptations of plants to changing pollinators, especially in urban ecosystems, which is the topic she's going to present today. And then moved to Italy, and from there very recently to France in Rennes, where she started her lecturer position, temporary lecturer position, now a month and a half ago. So the floor is yours. For everybody to know, we will have a short apéro, so drinks and snacks, where everybody's invited after the seminar. It's on the, where am I pointing? There, on the other side of the atrium. So everybody is more than welcome to continue if you have any questions that you want to ask or pop later, or you just want to chat, we're going to be there for half an hour-ish.
All right, let's check the big sound. All good for everybody? Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you, Maya, for the lovely presentation. You already said everything that's important to know in my work. I would just like to show you a small overview of, please work? Yes. All the different species that I have studied since my PhD and the different places where these studies took place. And you can see that, well, there is one that is kind of the outlier, but most of these species have pretty flowers. Because I'm interested in how plant mating systems, especially entomophilous plants, respond to environmental changes that are human-made, especially climate change and pollinator decline. So today I'm going to present you the results of my postdoc in Italy, which went by URBANPOLL, and URBANPOLL stands for Parallel Adaptation of Floral Traits to Urban Pollinators. So the postdoc took place at the University of Naples, but I was graciously hosted by the Maastricht University of Brno, and it was funded by a European Union Next Generation grant with Giovanni Scopece as the PI of the project. So speaking about urbanization, maybe you have noticed if you have visited several cities across Europe that they all kind of tend to look alike. You can see the old town that every tourist visits, the hipster neighborhood where the younger tourists go to get drunk, and then the very dreaded area around the central station that everybody tries to avoid. So from a touristic point of view, all cities tend to look alike. And from the point of view of any organism living in urban areas, they also tend to look alike. So urban areas can be characterized by high human population density, high levels of pollution, the existence of urban heat islands, and also the available habitats for urban populations are quite isolated, degraded, and highly fragmented. And then as we go further away from the urban city center towards more natural habitats, these factors tend to decrease. So this also creates a decline of adaptation to urbanization for the organisms that live in the city. And because all cities kind of look alike from this point of view, one can expect that urbanization creates these city-sized live experimental hubs where we can study the occurrence of parallel adaptations. So all urban populations can have similar adaptation trends in different cities. But things are actually not so simple when we add more factors in the equation. For example, if we look into the effects of climate, this study compiled data about the effect of urbanization on vegetation abundance along a gradient of aridity, going from very dry, arid cities towards wetter, temperate cities, showing that in arid climates, urbanization actually has a positive effect on vegetation abundance, and in temperate climates, urbanization has a negative effect on vegetation abundance. And this is quite interesting in and of itself, but even more so if we see that the vast majority of urbanization studies are actually concentrated in temperate climates in Europe and part of the USA and Canada, whereas the vast majority of megacities are concentrated in arid climates. So things get even more complicated if we add the effects of urbanization that has on species interactions. So since I'm going to be talking about plants and pollinators, this is a schematic illustration of how urbanization can have an effect on pollinators by modifying their activity, diversity, and the community composition. It can also have effects on the plant communities, but then plant communities provide food for the pollinators, and pollinators provide pollination services for the plants, which can then reproduce. So urbanization can directly affect plants and pollinators, but also their interactions. And if we assume that urbanization decreases the interactions between plants and pollinators, this can eventually lead to decoupling of plant and pollinator interactions. So under this scenario, we have negative effects of urbanization on pollinators and plants alike. But actually, the effects of urbanization are not so straightforward. And for example, if we look at how urbanization affects pollinator biodiversity, this will depend on one end on how do we define our natural habitats, which can be natural intact landscapes such as preserved lands, but can also be rural landscapes, which are not urban, but still under heavy human influence. And on the urban end, you can have urban areas that are characterized by urban sprawl, where you have these sparse human habitations that are interspersed with all kinds of urban greenery, or you can have urban densification, where you have high population densities and high percentage of impervious surface. So depending on which of these sites we compare, we can have negative effects of urbanization or positive effects of urbanization on pollinator diversity. So I use Trifolium repens as a model to study adaptation to urbanization. And this is a very good plant for this approach. First of all, because it has a very ubiquitous distribution. We can find it almost in any part of the world. So I can set up an urbanization study in any city that I go to. And it is also an insect-pollinated and self-compatible plant, which is particularly interesting for those that like to study plant-pollinator interactions. Moreover, we already know that Trifolium repens can respond to urbanization. So for example, here is a study in the urban area of Toronto, showing that as we go from the outskirts of the city towards the city center, pollinator visits increase, so we have positive effect of urbanization, and pollination success also increases with pollinator visits. And this multivariate phenotype, which is a combination of vegetative and floral traits, decreases when we go towards the city center. But today, perhaps the most famous study about Trifolium repens and urbanization is this global study that estimated cyanogenesis. This is production of HCN, which helps the plant to defend against herbivores in over 150 urban areas along urbanization gradients. And the main conclusion is that even though we have variation in declines of HCN production, overall, cyanogenesis increase when we go further away from the city center. So as we go towards more natural areas with higher diversity of insect communities and potentially more herbivores, cyanogenesis, the ability to defend against these herbivores, also increases in Trifolium repens. So I'm also using Trifolium repens on a slightly smaller scale than the previous study that was made by the GLUE consortium to see how does urbanization affect pollinator communities, flower traits across contrasting bioclimatic regions, to see if there are parallel trends of adaptation, and to see whether Trifolium repens populations are adapted to local pollinator communities. To do this, in 2024, with several collaborators, I conducted a massive field sampling campaign across Europe, where we had 12 cities with almost 100 populations distributed along a bioclimatic gradient, going from the Baltic in Northern Europe, temperate in Central Europe, and then arid Mediterranean in Southern Europe in Italy. And in each of the cities, I have between 2 and 16 populations sampled, for which I characterize the degree of urbanization by the percentage of impervious surface, the percentage of built-up areas. In each city, in each population, I then measured flower morphometry, so traits related to the size of flowers and inflorescence, the seed production, and also observed pollinators in standardized environmental conditions. So before going into the plant and pollinator observations, I just wanted to show you how does urbanization affect some of the abiotic factors. So from this point on, I will be using the same color code, blue being for Baltic climate. This is supposed to be yellow for a temperate climate and red for the Mediterranean climate. And going from the left to the right, I will always show a low percentage of urbanization on the left and high on the right. So in boreal climates, urbanization increases temperature, and so it does in Central Europe and in the Mediterranean. This is not very surprising. We know that urbanization creates this heat island effect, which increases and retains higher temperatures in urban areas. So what happens now with the plant traits? I measured a suite of traits related to flower and inflorescence morphology, which are all highly correlated, and I'm only showing you two today. First one is the banner length, that is the size of the largest petal. And we show that in boreal climates, banner length does not vary between urban and natural sites. Neither it does in continental climates, but it significantly decreases with urbanization in the Mediterranean climate. Another trait is the inflorescence diameter. And trust me, this is a different plot with different data, but we get exactly the same results. Urbanization does not affect inflorescence diameter in boreal and continental cities, but it does decrease inflorescence diameter in Mediterranean cities. So if you look at what happens within each city separately to test for the occurrence of parallel adaptation. So here you have side by side both of the traits in each climate. In boreal cities, we have no parallel trends. Sometimes you have positive, sometimes negative, sometimes non-significant results. In the continental climate, we have no parallel trends and no significant effects of urbanization in any of the urban areas that we studied. And in the Mediterranean, we have a parallel decrease of flower and inflorescence traits in 3 out of the 4 populations. The fourth one, which is misbehaving here, is the population, the city of Cosenza, which is a city with about 60,000 inhabitants, by far the smallest city of this study. So urbanization has parallel and negative traits in the Mediterranean, but not in the other climates. How does this affect plant fitness? Before that, apologies, these are one of the most recent results, so I keep forgetting that we already have them. But because we know that urbanization affects flower traits in natural populations, we also wanted to know whether do you observe differences between urban and natural populations is due to phenotypic plasticity or genetic differentiation. And for this, we had a common garden experiment set up at the University of Naples, where I did collect seeds from most of the populations that we measured in the urban areas, but unfortunately only the populations from Naples flowered on time to be presented today. So what we show in the common garden, so again, this is only populations in one city, and the results in the dark line correspond to the measurement of leaf size in the populations in their environment of origin. And the bright lines correspond to the measurements of the populations in the common garden, and you see that you have exactly the same trend. So we have these trait phenotypic shifts that persist in a common environment, which is indicative of the existence of evolutionary trait shifts. And it is exactly the same thing for the inflorescence diameter. So we do have an evolutionary response to urbanization, at least in one of the Mediterranean cities that we studied. The next one will be available probably next year. So then we looked into what happens with the fitness, which we estimated as the seed set. Unfortunately, we were not able to collect enough flowers, enough ripe fruits in the Baltic. So I'm only presenting the results about Central Europe and the Mediterranean. And in Central Europe, we see that there is a general trend of increase, which is not significant at the regional level, but it is driven by a positive effect of urbanization in 2 urban areas, Brno and Prague in the Czech Republic. Whereas in the Mediterranean, we have a negative effect of urbanization, which is mostly driven by the response in the populations in the cities of Naples and Salerno. So we have negative effects of urbanization on plant fitness in the Mediterranean and some positive effects in Central Europe. And now comes the pollinator part of URBANPOLL. So in addition to observing all the flower and reproductive traits, we also monitored pollinators for 15 minutes at least twice during the flowering season. But because many of the people contributing to the project were not entomologists per se, we only characterized the pollinators by big morphofunctional groups. So we have large bees, butterflies, bumblebees, managed bees, namely honeybees, small bees, and flies. And I looked into different indices of how to characterize the pollinator contribution, activity, and diversity. Here I'm showing the pollinators contribution, which is the percentage of visits per pollinator class. And what you can see, for example, is that managed bees, honeybees, have by far the largest contribution to the pollination pool, regardless of the site, regardless of urban or natural populations. That the contribution of bumblebees decreases in the Mediterranean, but this is mostly driven by the response in the urban area of Naples, and we detect no other trends in the Mediterranean. And overall, we actually don't see any consistent trends of in response to urbanization of the pollinator communities. So the pollinator part of URBANPOLL still remains kind of an open question, but we still wanted to know if there are any other factors that can observe this parallel trends, especially in the Mediterranean. So this is just a reminder how fitness due to sexual reproduction, to the production of seeds, changes between regions. And we also looked into the plant size because Trifolium repens is a highly clonal species, so it also reproduces vegetatively. And the plant size doesn't show any trends of parallel adaptation in Central Europe, but it does tend to increase with urbanization in the Mediterranean, again, in 3 out of the 4 populations that we studied. So we have exactly the opposite trend between sexual and clonal reproduction. And to further confirm the observed pattern, we also compared how does stolon diameter related to clonal reproduction on the x-axis here, and inflorescence diameter co-vary in the common garden. And you see clearly that there is a negative correlation, which indicates a trade-off between sexual and asexual reproduction as we go further into more urban populations. The trade-off. So where does this leave us with the general conclusions of URBANPOLL? When we look at the effects of urbanization across bioclimatic regions, we see that when it comes to floral traits, we detect no parallel trends in temperate and Baltic climates, but we have parallel decrease of floral traits in the Mediterranean. And this decrease is likely due to evolutionary trait shifts and not to phenotypic plasticity. We also see that urbanization tends to increase fitness in temperate and decrease fitness in more arid climates. And urbanization doesn't have an effect on clonal reproduction in temperate climates, but it does increase clonal reproduction in Mediterranean climates, which means there is a trade-off between sexual and asexual reproduction in the Mediterranean. When it comes to pollinators, we did not detect any generalized trends, at least with the pollinator data that we have here. But in 2025, we conducted another round of pollinator observations, which was much more in detail throughout the flowering season of Trifolium repens. So hopefully by this time next year, I might have a few more clues about this. So if you have to remember 3 things from this presentation, remember that the effects of urbanization can result in parallel adaptation within a bioclimatic region, but not necessarily between different bioclimatic regions. And the effects of urbanization seem to be more pronounced in the Mediterranean, where the environmental conditions with high aridity are already quite harsh. And currently, we cannot estimate any direct effects of pollinator communities on floral traits in Trifolium repens, but we still don't know if it is because there are no effects or because there's some kind of hidden interactions that hinder the visibility of these effects. So the project is still not done, even though I have changed positions and I still have plenty of different things running all around Europe. So in Naples, we still have the Common Garden experiment, where we would like to see if the patterns that we observed in the Mediterranean about evolutionary trait shifts also persist in other cities. Then I also have a lot of data, a lot of flower vouchers gathered in Central Europe throughout the flowering season. And I would like to see if floral traits, they might not be shifting between urban and natural gradients in Central Europe, but they might change throughout the flowering season if earlier flowering plants are smaller than later flowering ones. In Frankfurt, I have a great student, Dominik Schmidt, that is currently testing whether there are evolutionary responses in germination and dormancy of the seeds. And in Rennes, in French Brittany, I am hopeful to establish another city hub where I would be using data from this amazing project, the Zone Atelier Armorique, which collects data about the urban area of Rennes, but also natural areas in the north and the south of the region. And they have data on pollinators, on flower trait diversity, on land use, land coverage, and climate since 1999. So all I have to do there is add my trifolium data that I will gather next spring. So this is all I have to show you for today. I would like to thank you for your attention and also to thank all the people that contributed to the project listed here by bioclimatic gradient.